All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Afternoon Live. I didn't want to wait until 4:30 to have a happy hour, so I thought I'd rebrand it and do an Afternoon Live. Hopefully, some of you could make this time slot as well. And if not, you can always watch the replay, of course. Today, we are going to. Oh, if you don't know me for some reason and just randomly walking into this room, my name is Björk van Benediktsson. I am the author of Step by Step Mixing and the founder of Audio Issues. Today, we're going to talk about mastering because I just created and opened up the doors to a brand new course called Master Your Mixes. If you're interested in that, go to the link on the screen there, audio-issues.com/MYM. But I wanted to take the opportunity and do a Facebook Live and a YouTube Live, a live in general, and answer some questions that my students and my audience have about mastering. So feel free to put any questions you have about mastering as you're listening to me ramble on. Just put those in the comments, whether you're on Facebook or in the chat on YouTube, and I'll try to get through to those as well. I have quite a few questions here on the screen in front of me, and that I'll get to, but I definitely will not be ignoring you. So the more engagement you give me, the more engagement you get from me. All right, Scott's here. Good day, Björkvin. Good day to you. Feel free to let me know where you are coming from, where you're listening from. Usually at happy hour, I have a beer, but it's a little too early for that, so I'm just drinking a nice coffee. But cheers regardless. And Alan's here from Scotland. Great book. Oh, thank you. So, yeah, this book has helped a lot of people, and I'm really glad to hear that it helped you as well. So, before we get started about Master Your Mixes, you can check that out at the link there in front of me. But I was browsing Instagram, wasting time as one does on social media. And but don't leave, even though you're on social media. And I came across iZotope's Instagram feed, and they are having a sale on their iZotope Ozone 9 Elements plugin, which is the same mastering plugin that I use inside the Master Your Mixes course. And I show you how I tend to use it alongside with some stock plugins, some other plugins. So if you want a really great and cheap, an awesome mastering tool, I highly recommend clicking on that link that and checking it out there. It's only $29 at the moment, and I don't get any commissions or anything from sharing it with you. I just wanted to make sure that you had access to it if you wanted it. It is the same plugin that I use on occasion in the course, so I thought you might find it useful to use. All right, let's get into some questions here. Eric here is here from Belgium, and Scott, he's in Australia. It's 6 a.m. Yep. 6 a.m. tomorrow, I believe. Yeah. All right. So question number one from Gary Tobin. He is an incredible jazz musician. He's an Insiders member of mine, and he has a question about mastering. He says, I've noticed on many pro mix mastering audio deliverables that the audio waveform is relatively uniform, almost as if the entire audio file or nearly so has been clipped, like a hedge trimmer has been taken to the audio waveform, but there is no audible evidence of clipping. What is being used to achieve this? Is there some loudness plugin being used? What is the trick to achieving this? Simple limiting does not do this. Limiting still produces a waveform that has that dynamics. Well, it is actually just brick wall limited. So all of the peaks have been cut off, and I would say that the mix is basically they've either turned the threshold down on the limiter so that it goes all the way into not just taking off the peaks, but going into the main body of the waveform. And they're raising the level so that the peaks are all the way over here, or like above, and then all gets cut off. And that just becomes a big fat sausage. So it's basically, if you push more into a limiter and that limiter has a particular ceiling, it's just going to cut off anything that goes into that limiter, and it'll keep doing so regardless of how much you push into it, and you will end up with a really, really squashed mix and a squashed master at that point. So a limited waveform can't, so like you cut off the peaks, but if you push it too hard, it will simply anything shave off anything you put into it. It's kind of like, if you were making a sausage and you're cramming it through, but nothing actually comes through on this side, but the actual meat actually seems to vanish somewhere. That's my explanation for that. Um, Daniel Long, he's a new Master Your Mixes member. Hey, welcome. Good to see you. He's in Birmingham. Daniel Keo is here in Berlin, 10 p.m. here. Great. It's great that I can do this in the afternoon. Then some of my European audience members can join, which is great. When I do it at 4:30 here, it's pretty much the middle of the night everywhere else. So Colja is from Belgium. I could have a beer, but don't have one in the house. Well, if you have a beer, have one later, I guess. Steve asks, why is louder mastering viewed as better? A CD is capable of 96 dB of dynamic range. Compressing, limiting, clipping the life out of the audio seems a great waste of the media's ability. Yes, you are correct. It is, doesn't seem very, it seems pointless to take off all of the dynamics of a dynamic and great mix. There is such a thing as too dynamic of a mix where the peaks are way louder than the valleys. That's not desirable either. So there's a happy medium there. And because we mostly, I know you say CDs here, but I mostly talk about mastering for streaming and mastering single songs, because when you're in your music career, or if most of my audience are home studio musicians that are releasing their own songs, and I recommend you release your own songs as singles so that you always are working on something new and always releasing something. And so a lot of my mastering advice is based off of streaming. So that means that the 1 dB ceiling of the limiter is recommended for streaming, whereas for CDs, I think you can get away with minus 0.3 or something like that. So, but I always put a -1 because everybody's listening to stuff on streaming these days, and that's just kind of how it is. But louder isn't, well, first of all, louder is better. If you compare two identical mixes and one is 1 dB louder, you will automatically think that that one is better because of the way your ears are created. However, there's a difference between too loud, where all the dynamics have been shaved off, similar to the previous question that Gary asked. But you want to get that perfect best of both worlds, or a happy medium, where you get good dynamics while preserving punch and loudness, because you don't want your mix to be too quiet so that it sounds quieter than anything else. Although streaming services do level match, YouTube, I think, does not level match as well. So they either don't turn you up or don't turn you down, or don't do either. You want to make sure that you're at least not being turned, or you want to make sure that that it isn't a lost opportunity to use those extra few dBs. So if your mix is saying that, I use a metering tool called, let's see here. I use a metering tool called loudness penalty, which tells me, pasting a link from Meter Plugs, and I use that tool to tell me whether my mix will be turned up or down on streaming services. And I try to aim for about, obviously try to aim for 0, that it isn't being turned up or down. But I definitely, if I had the choice, I would pick being turned down slightly, a couple dBs, rather than needing to be turned up, because some streaming services, I believe, don't turn you up, and at that point your mix will sound quieter and therefore not as good as anything else. All right, let's move on here. Oh, Colja has, how does mastering for recorded acoustic instruments differ from typical band recordings? Think recording a classical chamber orchestra. I don't have a lot of experience in classical chamber orchestra, although I've mixed and mastered symphony and things with strings in them. But I would say that you want to get the loudness at least as loud as you possibly can. but you don't want to squash a bunch of the peaks with limiting, because orchestral music is meant to be very dynamic. So you don't want to do a ton of limiting or a ton of compression. And you might actually have to ride the quieter parts up with volume, as opposed to pushing it down, pushing the louder parts down with compression, because you don't want to screw with the natural dynamics that the conductor actually wanted that performance to convey. All right. Scott says, oh, oops, I clicked on there we go. Scott says, I upgraded from Ozone Elements to the full version of Ozone 9 when it was on special, and it's amazing. Yeah, a lot of my students, a lot of my Insiders members have the full version of Ozone, and it's great. I use Ozone Elements as the last part of my chain, and then I have a multiband compressor from Fabfilter. I have the Pro MB, and then I have the Pro Q3. So those are my linear phase EQs and my multiband compressor, and then it goes into Ozone. And I sometimes have this plugin called Gutfuss, which is an automatic EQ sort of thing, which is kind of hard to explain what it does, but it's great. All right. So Lance asks, we are a church and we are live streaming our Sunday worship services. We run everything that goes out to the stream through Ableton Live with a separate mixer to try to get the best sound for live stream that we can. How can we get that sparkle to our sound when running it live through a DAW, then through an encoder, and then out to the web? So without knowing completely about the situation of like what the codec is and how it's encoded to go out in the web, that's sort of beyond what I can answer here. But what I would say is make sure that you are monitoring at the last stage of the DAW. So whatever's coming into the DAW as being recorded live, you want to be monitoring either with probably headphones, because you're doing this live. You want to be monitoring at that very last stage on the master bus before that is then sent out to some streaming codec, because you want to get that absolute best sound there. So that's where you should be trying to get the best sound. You don't necessarily have as much control over how the streaming stuff sounds, just because of all the variables on streaming platforms in general. You know, I don't necessarily always know how my voice is going to come over the live stream. I use this software called Audio Movers when I'm streaming high quality audio over the internet, but make sure that to get the best sound quality possible before streaming, you want to make sure you're monitoring at the right spot. All right. You're welcome, Colja. No problem there. If you're just joining us, we are talking about mastering to celebrate the Master Your Mixes course that I just opened up enrollment for. Is open today and tomorrow. So if you're interested in knowing and understanding how to master your mixes using sort of my process, very much adapted from the step-by-step mixing book, I thought about calling the course Mastering with 3 Plugins, kind of like mastering with mixing with 5 plugins. But there's a little more to it than that. So I decided against it. If you have any questions about mastering, please feel free to put them in the chat there, and we'll get to them as we go through. I think I'm planning on being here for about an hour, or until my voice cuts out. All right, let's go into the next question. Guy asks, as a self-taught artist, I spend a lot of time self-educating. I don't have a specific flow or order when mixing and such. All in all, I understand mastering is making your tracks similar or equivalent in volume, maybe sound or style, in regards to every other track on an album or EP, mixtape, etc. But I've been told that you can master singles, which I don't quite understand. 1, how may you master an individual track? 2, what different kinds of plugins, stock Ableton preferably, but I also do, okay. And effects can I use to what plugins should I be using when I'm mastering to emphasize an expected vibe or song, making it as great as possible? And 3, could you explain in detail the plugins and effects so I have a better understanding of them? And 4, what is good order or flow in which I can go when mastering? All right, got a 4-in-1 question there. So when you're mastering an entire album, you're trying to get all the songs sounding at the same loudness, sort of having the same frequency balance, so that they can flow in, so that they feel like they're in the same ballpark when it comes to both the balance overall, and the overall loudness, so that it sounds like a record. As you know, when you play an album from start to finish, it makes sense. The songs actually feel like they belong together. But when you're mastering singles, it's a little bit different. I master an individual track on the mix bus or on the master fader. It's simply an extension of my mix bus processing, but I do treat it separately. And I do my mastering at the end when I'm pretty happy with how my mix sounds. So I mix the song first. If I'm mixing and mastering a song, I mix the song first. I do some mix bus processing. Usually this is saturation, some glue, some sort of compression glue. I have various types of plugins that I put on there. And then mix the rest of the track. And once the track is sounding really good, and I'm kind of happy with how that is as a final mix, I will then, especially if I'm sending this over to a client or a student that I'm mixing things for, I put master bus processing on in order to make that mix sound like a finished mastered record, because I only want my stuff to be compared, because I don't have any control over whether my mixes get compared to professional records. They will always be compared to whatever they like the sound of. And if my mix doesn't sound as loud or as dynamic or as punchy or professional or like it belongs next to a playlist of their favorite songs, they won't like my mix as much. So I treat it separately and I do it at the end. And then the most important plugins that I use during mastering are linear phase EQ, multiband compression, and limiting. And then I tend to use parallel compression sometimes too. The ArtTG mastering chain from Waves has a really cool sort of built-in parallel limiter that I like using. And then I use tape saturation and widening as well. And I tend to do all of that stuff at the end when I know that my mix is sounding as good as possible. And then one extra thing here, and I'll find, let's see here. Yeah, it's there's this plugin from Meter Plugs and my good friend Ian Shepard. He created this plugin called the Perception plugin, which you can put on your master bus. So so you put one instance on the before all the plugins, and then one at the end, and then it automatically bypasses all plugins at once, so you can actually tell whether your mix and master sounds better or just louder. So I use that in the Master Your Mixes course too, and you can check out that plugin at audio-issues.com/Klingon. And I came up with that redirect link just because when people talk about mastering, sometimes it feels like they're speaking Klingon, especially when you're just starting out. Yeah, so let's see if there's any questions here in the chat. Is it possible to do decent mastering with 5-inch monitors and great headphones? Plan on dynamic. This is my situation now. Yeah. So the biggest issue you're going to run into is low end response. And so I have a subwoofer in here, and I have 3 sets of monitors, but I also mix on my my Apple earbuds that sound like shit. Because I want to make sure that it sounds decent to the person that's going to play that music while they're on a walk or whatever, or on a run. And so your biggest issue is going to be that those monitors won't accurately identify what the low end is like. So you're gonna have to check your mixes in a, like, if you can find a subwoofer somewhere would be great. When I didn't have a subwoofer, I used to use my surround system in my living room because that has a sub. Obviously a surround system also makes your mix sound different, so like it's just another set of speakers to check your mix translation from. And then you can use a frequency analyzer as a last resort, sort of to make sure that there aren't any abnormal bumps in the low end that you can't accurately hear. You want it to be sort of sort of flat from it usually goes, let's see, it usually goes, up from 30 hertz, and then you want it to be sort of level up until the high mids, and then it gradually goes down. That's what you want the frequency response to sort of look like. It's slightly different depending on what the genres are. Obviously, super bass heavy genres might have more low end response and more low end energy there, and that will be identified by the frequency analyzer. But your biggest issue is going to be the low end. And then I don't know what the frequency response of your headphones are, but headphones are also great. I tend to use SonarWorks Reference 4 to tell me where and it's sort of a monitoring. It's like a room monitoring. What do you call it? Well, it basically makes my monitors sound flatter than they are, because every room is different. Every room has nodes, has like standing waves, and so it measures my monitors so that I can be sure that the frequency response that I'm hearing out of the monitors is flatter. So I toggle that on and off to make sure that things are sounding balanced, both on a completely flat frequency response, but that's also unrealistic because people don't listen to music on flat speakers and monitors, flat speakers and earbuds. That's just simply not how the average consumer listens to music. So you want to make sure that also sounds good everywhere else. Hugo asks, can you use any compressor you want, or are some significantly better than others? Some people really like certain compressors on the mix bus more than others, for sure. The Fairchilds are very popular on the mix bus. The SSL bus compressor on the mix bus. For mastering, there's the Shadow Hills mastering. I think mastering compressor is pretty popular. I've never used it though. I don't. It looks cool though. I don't. I think honestly, you just have to get away. You can get away with whatever you have, because I want you to be able to understand what you're doing, so that you can get good results with whatever tools you have available on hand now, because you will hopefully upgrade to something later down the line. So if you only have one type of compressor, that's just the compressor that you need to use until you either have money to invest in something new or want to buy something new. But my main goal is to help you understand how these tools work, not which one you need to buy. I would say for mastering, probably transparency is key. You don't want it to sort of, you don't want it necessarily to color the sound, especially if your mix is already sounding pretty good. You will just want it to raise the level and maybe clean up the frequency response if there are any particular areas that need tamed. Sanal asks, what do you use to get width in the master so that it sounds as good as the commercial tracks? I get the levels, but struggle to get width and space. So I do two things on the mix. During the mixing phase, I have a parallel bus that has a compressor and the S1 imager from Waves. Whatever imager plugin should work the same way. Just whatever is makes your signal go wide. And then I have that on a parallel chain so that I can send things that I want to sound wider to that bus, and then it'll sort of open up the mix a lot. So that's what I use for individual tracks during the mixing phase. And then on my master bus, I sometimes use the widener on the Abbey Road mastering plugin from Waves, and then I tend to always put the widener on the Ozone plugin. So I put it at like 20, and that seems to open up the mix a lot. So like I said before, if you're just getting started, or if you're just arriving, we talked about Ozone Elements being $29 today, so you can check that out. There's a link in the chat or in the comments there. All right, let's move on here. Let's go to one of the pre-written questions here. Greg asks, fought for years mixing only to send to the mastering plugin and it just falls apart. How do I know my mix is ready for mastering, EQ, balance, and levels? Any pre-mastering tools, checklists, etc.? Well, so check your mix on every speaker you can find. It has to have a balanced frequency response from lows to highs. I talked about that earlier. And then one of the actual bonuses inside the Master Your Mixes is the Mix Translation Masterclass that walks you through my process to finishing a song. And then I have the mastering checklist, which is 20 questions to ask yourself as you are finishing or as you're starting mastering. So definitely something that I highly recommend checking out. All right, let's check this. How would you characterize the use of emulated analog gear like the UAD or a lot of the plugin alliance plugins versus more digital tools like Fabfilter for mastering? I really like saturation overall. I put saturation on my mix bus, and I like the tape equalizer on the Abbey Road plugin. So it's definitely great if you want to add color. I would be aware of gain staging and gain structure, because if you hit plugins that are supposed to emulate analog gear too hard, they will distort. The 32-point floating or the 32-bit floating point processing doesn't necessarily always apply to plugins that have built-in programming that's supposed to emulate something that it should distort. So make sure that you are cognizant of that when you are working with them, when you're putting them in your chain. I use transparent stuff when I want things to be transparent. So like the Fabfilter stuff I use for mastering mostly, but I do use the tape equalizer on the Abbey Road mastering chain. So a little bit of both, and if it makes the mix sound cooler or more vibey, then I use that. But a lot of my sonic choices happen in the mixing phase. Daniel asks, is it mandatory to do mastering at high volume? My neighbor's not so happy with this. No, I don't think you should master at high volumes at all. You need, I was taught, and I do recommend, this is what I tend to do. I master at 2 levels, or I mix and master at 2 levels. One is sort of a relatively quiet one, about 70 dB. You can just download a dB meter on your phone, and you just you turn your interface up to until your mix is sounding at 70 dB, and that's where you mix at for that session. And then I tend to crank it up and listen to it loud, just so that I can hear, because everything sounds better louder because of the way your ears are designed, and there's going to be more bass, there's going to be more highs. That's why the loud button on a stereo makes everything sound better at quieter volumes, because it just pushes the bass and the treble up. And so I would recommend 2 different levels, so that you can hear that your mix is sounding good quietly, or at a quiet level, and then also that your mix isn't getting out of control in the highs and the lows when you're mixing at a high level. I watched this video of Andrew Sheps yesterday. He was talking about mixing at low levels, and one of the things that I thought was interesting that he mentioned that if you can't hear the drums, or if things are disappearing at low levels, a lot of times it has something to do with the transients of the signal. So maybe something is compressing too hard, or maybe the attack is too fast on the drums, so that initial transient isn't coming through, and you won't be able to hear it at a low level. So, all right, let's go to the questions here on the side. If you're just joining us, please let me know if there are any questions about mastering that you want answered. Just put them in the chat there. I will be going through these questions here on the side, but obviously I'm here for you because you showed up. So I want to make sure that your question gets answered too. We are here to do a quick question and answer session because of Master Your Mixes. My brand new course on mastering your mixes is out now, and it's open today and closes tomorrow night. So if you're interested in understanding how to use linear phase EQ, how to get louder mixes before mastering, and then how to master your songs up to competitive levels, especially if you're mastering single songs. That's the course for you. So just check that out at the URL there, audio-issues.com/MYM. All right, Victor asks, what is the best mastering tool plugin right now in your opinion? Also, which one is the have to have? Like, okay, so what do I recommend? Again, the best tools you need are the ones you have or you have access to. Um, I want you to know how to use the plugins or how to use the processing before I tell you which plugins to buy. But I can tell you which plugins I use. For the mix bus processing on my template, I usually have saturation, Saturn, the Fabfilter Saturn. I have a Pultec, I have the Waves PukeTech. I have the F6 from Waves that I almost never use. It's a dynamic EQ, nothing against dynamic EQs, but I use the Fabfilter Pro Q3 a lot more for that particular reason. I use the Greg Wells Mixcentric a lot. And then I've recently started using the Joel Wanasek, I think, one of the Joey Sturgis bus glue plugins. That one is really, really great. So that's what's on my mix bus. And then on my my mastering chain is a linear phase EQ. Usually the preset there is a 32 hertz filter in the stereo spectrum, because anything below 32 hertz is unnecessary. And then I sometimes have I always have this built into the preset, as I have a 75 hertz filter on the sides. So all the bass information is put into the center of the signal. So that just cleans up your low end and sort of channels all the low end into the center of the spectrum, or center of the mids, the mid of the mid side, if you will. From there, I go into the Pro MB, which is the multiband compressor. From there, I think the TG, the Waves mastering chain is first. It's somewhere in there. And then from the multiband compressor, it goes into Gullfoss, which is my automatic EQ plugin, which is really great. I use that a lot. And then from there, it goes into the Ozone Elements, which has a compensatory EQ. So if something is being compressed by the multiband compressor and I want some of those frequencies to come back after the compressor, after they're being compressed by the compressor, I have an EQ module there. And then I have a widener that I use, and then I have the limiter. And the limiter has two different options that I toggle between, just to see which one I like the most. Oh, and then also metering plugins, super important. I use almost all of the, let me see here. I use almost all of the meter plugs plugins. So that's the loudness penalty plugin, the dynameter, super great, and the perception plugin. Those are my go-tos. And then I have the WLM LUFS meter from Waves, and then I have the Voxengo span frequency analyzer, which is free. I think you can just go to voxengo.com. Let's see if I can find that. Voxengo, probably .com, right? Yeah. Well, I'll put that in the chat here. And just grab that frequency analyzer there. That's one of my favorite ones. It's actually the only one I use. I don't use the ones that come with Logic, and I don't feel the need. There's nothing another frequency analyzer can give me that this one doesn't give. It doesn't do anything. It just shows you what is happening, and I feel like this one does it really, really well. Okay, Tom Kinsella actually finished a really cool hard rock mix for him, sort of reminiscent of Nightwish, sort of a slight, but almost metal, I guess. But beautiful female vocals, really hard driving drums and guitars. Finished that this week. I had a lot of fun with it. He asks, when mixing, we're always advised to use a reference mix of a song we already love. Is an unmastered mix ever going to sound as good as a professionally mastered commercial mix? And if not, what's the advantage of using a reference track in this way? How different should a finished mix sound from a mastered version? Also, what's the advantage of mastering using a bounced stereo mix rather than just doing it on the mastered fader of your mix session? All right, so this is actually why I think it's so important to know how to master your mixes, because if you are trying to master the mix that you are working on, and you have a commercially mastered mix as your reference track, you should be able to get much closer to what the commercial mix sounds like, because that's a mastered mix and you're also trying to master your mixes. So you can master your mix to get to those commercial levels. And however, a finished mix should not sound too drastically different from a mastered version. What a mastering job is or does, what we do is just really balancing the frequencies, gluing the dynamics together, adding certain squeeze in a way, and you're raising the loudness so that the song sounds as loud as anything else, especially as loud as whatever reference track you're using. And then if you're mastering your own mixes, which you should, again, I recommend mastering on the master fader or just at the bottom of the mix bus if you want, because if you run into, so this is the question of like, why should I master the bounced stereo, or should I master on the master fader? So I recommend mastering on the master fader if you're just releasing this one song and it stands alone and it's not a part of a bigger whole, or a record, or an album, or an EP. So because if you're mastering your own mixes and you're mastering on the master fader of your mixing session, you can easily fix any mix problem your mastering processing is showing you. So if you're raising the level, or if you're adding like a broad EQ boost somewhere, and that brings out too much low end or too much of the bass guitar, you should be able to hear, oh, this low end problem, you can just boost it up. Just, you dial in your EQ and you sweep, just sort of do the seek and destroy method of like boosting up with a really high Q, and you sweep until you hear that frequency problem like jumping out at you. And usually you can hear whether that is let's say the low end. Maybe you'll definitely be able to hear whether that frequency problem is because of the bass guitar or the kick drum, or maybe it's the low end of something else, at which point you can go back in your mix, you just scroll to the mix and you fix it there, instead of doing drastic EQ changes on the master fader, because you want to be subtle in your EQ boosts and cuts. I do a lot of half dB here, half dB here, up to maybe 2 tops 3 dB boosts and cuts. Some questions coming out here. Chuck asks, how do you feel about virtual mix rooms for mixing and mastering, such as Waves NX? So I've never used Waves NX, so I don't know. I can't really tell you. My mixing room, even though it's really just a converted garage, has plenty of acoustic treatment sort of around here in the early reflection zones here. Kind of covering this window I have. There's bass traps lined up in these corners and up here. So it's pretty treated in sort of pretty balanced. And also I have a ceiling, what do you call it? Cloud. I have like an absorption cloud overhead. And so I find, and knowing my monitors, I find that enough. However, I had the opportunity to use SonarWorks Reference 4, and I tuned, and I calculated with their little microphone, I calculated the frequency response of the room, and then it allows me to flatten the frequency response of my main monitors, which are the Focal CMS 50s with the sub, and toggling that on and off enables me to hear a really wide swath of frequency responses to make sure that my mix translates in all of these different aspects. So I haven't used those plugins, but I wouldn't say that they are unnecessary. I don't have anything against. I'm not a purist or a snob in any of these ways. I think it's a waste of time to argue about what other companies, when companies come up with solutions that they think might work to help musicians and engineers improve their skills. I think all the power to them. That's great, as long as it's not snake oil, as long as it works. So if it helps you get good results, I'm all for it. Aston asks, I struggle with vocal placement when mixing. Compression and volume automation help. Is there a general rule to where it should sit before mastering? I thought mastering helps to lift it forward. Uh, so I can give you some vocal sit tips. I tend, especially in, so if you think of the vocal track as one, and then whatever instrument tracks, whether it's a beat or a rock song or whatever, think of that as one element and one sort of harmonic element. I like creating EQ pockets in sort of the high mids from like 8 to 900 to about 3K. So I cut sort of a wide cut in the instruments in the instrument bus. Usually, this is very often the guitar bus, and then once I cut maybe 3 dB there, the vocal kind of sits in that area better. Especially if you add then maybe a boost in 3K. That helps sit and make that help that vocal sit. I think compression will definitely help, and I also think parallel compression and saturation could help make it sit well in the mix. And then automation, of course. You automate the vocal volume up to the places where you want it to be sitting in the mix, and then you might add some glue on the master or mix bus that sort of glues everything together. And then as an advanced trick, you can also use a mid side EQ and put a mid boost in the high mids on the mix bus or on the master fader, and you just sort of sweep around until the vocal is sort of popping through a little bit more, and then you just leave it there. You kind of make it sit there because you are bringing out the vocal, which is usually in the center of the mix. Maybe everything else is around, but you're bringing out that vocal high mid presence in the middle of the signal, in the mid, in the central, in the mid of the mid side frequency. I don't never know how to explain that, but so I hope that helps. All right, let's put one question over here. Steven asks, I'm playing extreme metal and hardcore and record DIY at home, but when it comes to the mix at this end, when I try to master it loudly, it distorts. What's the best way to get the volume without the crackle? So this sounds like you're not using limiting, or you're distorting things through your mix bus or master bus chain. So make sure that you have minus 1 dB ceiling on your limiter when you're pushing things through it, because otherwise it will go above 0 and end up distorting, and nobody likes digital clipping. And then also be aware of the gain structure throughout the mix bus and the mastering bus processing. So because between plugins, you want to make sure that you're not distorting things coming in or out of each plugin, especially with, as I talked about before, analog emulation that are designed to distort. All right, let's go back to the chat here. Colja asks again, do you master within your DAW using a mastering tool such as Wavelab? Because I almost predominantly mix and master single songs for my students and clients, and as part of courses and things of that nature, I just do it inside my DAW. So in this case, Logic. So I have a PreSonus Studio One, and I know that they have a pretty sweet mastering suite that's sort of, you can toggle between the mix and the mastering session, and that's something that I might experiment with later. But at this moment, it's unnecessary. Yeah, Chuck says thanks for the reply. Thank you for chiming in. Yeah, so treat your environment. It's important to have some form of acoustic treatment. If you're, I would hate for you to be trying to master in a completely reverberant room, in a bathroom or somewhere like that. It's you're not going to hear what's coming out of your speakers. Oh, this is a good question here from John. Would it be more advantageous to wait a day or two? Let's turn this air down. There's a 114-degree warning in Tucson for this weekend, so my studio is going to get really hot. But anyway, would it be more advantageous to wait a day or two before mastering your own mixes because you have fresh use? Yeah. So if you've been mixing all day, you lose objectivity. definitely take a break. Maybe listen to your mixes for fun, bounce them out, listen to your mixes for fun on other speakers, make mental notes on like, oh, maybe this should be better, maybe that should be better. And then you revisit the mix maybe a day or two after, and then you have fresh ears, you're rested. I know that if I mix for a really long time, I will think everything sounds muddy because I simply like I've been dulled to the high mid frequencies. If you're mixing too long on with with a high volume, you're just your ears are gonna try to protect themselves, and they'll be dulling those high mids and high frequencies because of the constant sonic attacks your music is is causing them. So yes, take breaks and come back with fresh set of ears. You'll make better sonic decisions that way. All right. Arthur asks, when I master a song that has a fade out and I add compression, the compression seems to want to fight against the fade by boosting the lowering volume. How do I need to configure the fade out for those final bars of the song? I don't completely understand the question, but that doesn't happen to me. It seems like you have a fade out of a track that's then being sent to a compressor or an expander that's trying to boost the volume. Your fade out should always be the last thing. So it's the last thing in the chain. So the volume is basically, you can just automate the volume of the master or mix bus, for instance, or when you bounce things out, you should just bounce the fade, or you should put the fade on the 2-track master, and it's the fade is always the last thing in the chain because it's kind of independent from the chain. That hasn't happened to me, so I'm not entirely sure um, what the specifics are. But feel free to ask any further questions. We're about, I think I'll stay for 15-20 more minutes or so, depending on how much you want to ask me, and how much you want to hang out. If you're just coming by now, we are talking about mastering. I'm answering questions about mastering because we're celebrating my new course, which is Master Your Mixes, something that I have not talked about a lot in the last few years. I've been focusing very much on mixing, but I find that mastering your mixes so that they sound as loud and punchy and professional as those commercial professional releases you inevitably will compare your songs to, I think it's an important part of the mix process, and that's why I created this course and put that together. So if you're interested in knowing more about that, go to audio-issues.com/mym, which is the link that's on the screen there in front of me, and check that out there. It opened yesterday. A lot of people have already joined and are working through the materials, and it closes down tomorrow. And I'm not entirely sure when I'm going to open the course up again in the same format or with the same bonuses and the same content that's in there. So if you want to check it out at this price, this is the time to do that. So just wanted to let you know about that. All right. Jeff asks how to mix so well that it's better than most masters. Well, you learn to understand how mastering can help you make your mixes so good you hardly need a mastering engineer because you've basically done it yourself. So some mixes are actually so good that all they need is maybe a touch of limiting, a little bit of stuff here and there, and that's it. So obviously, how do you make a really, really great mix? You practice mixing until you become really, really good. I can't ever teach you practice. You have to practice yourself. Everything comes from experience. I can only teach you sort of the shortcuts and the processes that have worked for me. I will tell you, my friend Ian Shepard, who is the mastermind behind some of the meter plugins that I use a lot, he mastered my record back when I was in a band called The Long Wait. And we did a whole mastering Q&A thing about that record back then, or that album back then. And I remember this one particular song where he said like, oh, I didn't put any EQ on. Yes, it was perfectly fine as it was. I just added maybe a little bit of compression and then some limiting and loudness to compare it so that it compared and worked cohesively with the rest of the mix. So if you mix so well that there are no sonic problems, then don't need EQ. And if you're like Andrew Sheps, that mixes so loud that you hardly need anything other than just a limiter, then you're pretty good at mixing. All right, let's go into the chat here again. Let's see what we got. When doing a fade out, how important is it to counter the ear's frequency response with EQ? Can you? I'll come back to you. Can you elaborate? To me, a fade out is just lowering the volume. Sometimes you want to do it just straight down. Sometimes you need to check the curve there, but I don't know how that what the frequency response of your ears matters when it comes to fading out your song. Aston asks, when mastering in Logic with stock plugins, what would you suggest using for saturation? Yeah, so this is my biggest problem and pet peeve with Logic, that they don't have saturation that is as sort of subtle as maybe like the tape emulations that you can get. They do have in the new Logic, I think they have a tube EQ, and which is basically an emulation of a Pultec EQ, and on that particular EQ there is an analog or a saturation or a tube module, or sort of like a warmth thing or whatever, that is probably supposed to emulate tube warmth. So I would go there first, but there's also a ton of free saturation plugins. Let me see. I actually do have a really good post on my blog written by Will from EDM Tips, and it's saturation, the secret weapon of mixing, plus the 5 best free saturation plugins. So I'll post that here, and it goes through what saturation is and how you should use it, and then it gives you 5 top 5 free saturation plugins in his opinion, which is the soft tube saturation knob, the Voxengo tube amp, the shattered glass SGA 1566, the Klanghelm IVGI, and the LVC free fuzz. And it's all the links to all of those are in that blog that I just posted. So check that out. Okay. Let's go. What is the simplest Quincy Valentine? Oh, excuse me. What is the simplest and most accurate way to master? Would you choose dynamics or EQ as the last touch? Well, I think, well, usually EQ is my last touch, but it's never really an either or situation. My basic mastering chain is gain, EQ, linear phase EQ, multiband compression, and then an EQ, a compensatory EQ. Usually this is the EQ in ozone, and then it goes to limiting. So and that's after I do any sort of small gain reduction on with maybe some compression on the mix bus. Hugo elaborates, with lower volumes, I think some frequencies drop in perceived volume faster than others. For example, around 3K is perceived the loudest and extreme lows, highs the low. Yeah, so if you Google the Fletcher-Munson curve, it basically shows you that we are most sensitive to high mids and high mids. So basically, as he says, around 3K. And obviously those will be the last to be heard because they are technically loudest. They have the most perceived loudness, I guess, or volume. But I don't do anything to compensate for that. I don't think a fade out is basically just signaling that the song is over, and especially when it's a fade out on a song and not just a fade on a track. So I don't think that there's any necessary. There's no benefit to a fade out being perfect in frequency response on the way down. It's just like a volume. It's a volume knob. You just turn it down. Yeah. You're welcome. Thank you for the massive whitening trick. Just went to try it now and it worked. Oh, well, great. So I'm glad I helped somebody while I was here. That's awesome. You're welcome. It's very simple trick on the ozone. Uh, so check that out. I go through that a little bit in more detail inside the Master Your Mixes course that you can join there. All right. John asks, when using reference tracks, is it better to use a professionally mastered CD or the digital versions from iTunes just as good to copy and paste into your session? I do recommend using high res files, so not MP3s. I use MP3s as references when it comes to like the overall balance of a mix. It doesn't matter if you have a 320 kilobytes per second MP3 or a 1411 kilobytes per second wave, which is lossless CD quality. I don't think that you're going to be able to gauge where the drums are sitting and where the guitars are and what the overall balance of the mix is, regardless of the bit rate, of the actual song. But if you want to compare your mixes with reference tracks, I would recommend high res files. I have a folder of a bunch of songs from here and there that if I have a genre that I'm working on and I want to use a reference track, I will pull that in, and that's just ripped out from CDs, because I have like an outboard CD drive that I just import CDs that I have. So that's pretty old school, but I don't think I have a good resource for where you can find high res audio other than just maybe FLAC files. But yeah. So yeah, I would import the CD waves and paste them into your session. All right. Daniel, sorry, man, how often did you speak about if we need to listen to high volumes when we master? I did. Basically, short answer is 70 dB and 80 dB, and you can go through the replay to find the more elaborate answer. All right, let's do a couple more questions here. Let's find, if you have more questions, now is your chance to submit them in the chat or as a comment on Facebook. I'm going to go through a few more questions here, and then we'll be done for the day. And if you want, of course, to know more about mastering and learn my process from A to Z on mastering your mixes and getting your mixes to be loud, and knowing what you need to do when you're preparing your mix for mastering, how to use the tools, and both the actual plugins that manipulate the sound, as well as the metering tools that tell you when your mixes are within a good ballpark of being ready. All of that can be found inside the Master Your Mixes course, which is at audio-issues.com/MYM, or on the you can check the link out there in front of you. All right, let's see here. What are the considerations that one uses to set the threshold on the limiter? So the threshold is always dependent on what the incoming signal is. The threshold isn't, there's no like one place you should put a threshold. It's always depending on what the audio is doing, at what level the audio is coming in. I've heard that some EQ issues in the mastering process are better solved in the mixing process. How does one know which is which? So if you hear problems while mastering that can be easily identified as a particular instrument or a particular track in a mix, for instance, you hear that, oh, the kick is too boomy, but the bass seems fine, then it's a mixing problem, because it doesn't just need more or less low end. It actually needs a kick drum fix rather than a frequency fix. So at that point, it's a mixing problem. All right. When a mix sounds balanced at lower volumes, what should be one's approach to make it louder, keeping the dynamics of the mix? Because wrong choices can ruin the dynamics and the energy. Yeah, so one thing that pops to mind here is being aware of the attack and release on your compressors, because if you're at a low level and there's a fast attack, those transients won't be heard as much. And you want a balanced frequency response. And then you also want to make sure that you are, when you're doing multiband compression, you want to make sure that you're picking the right bands on the compressor. So if you're compressing, if you have low, if you need to glue the low end, that you are not gluing the low end and then also letting some of the mids through. You want to make sure that you are finding the right frequency bands in order to get in order for one compressor to just attack the low and the low mids, and then you maybe have the middle band. If you have a 3-band multi-band compressor, for instance, then you have that's just attacking or squeezing the middle of the mix, and then you have one band in the highs that might be attacking the high end differently. And you can tweak the attack and release of all those different bands so that they're all sort of they're all treating each frequency band slightly differently. So I show you, so in the Master Mixes course, when I'm doing the multiband compression, in the multiband compression module or in the multiband compression video, I show you exactly what I mean and you'll hear exactly what happens when you accidentally put the release too slow and the attack too fast, because it'll definitely kill the dynamics of the mix and it'll just feel flat and it won't have any energy. So it's super important to actually set those bands correctly, obviously depending on what music you're working on and what the track is asking you to do, basically. So check that out if you want further information about multiband compression, the frequency bands, and using the attack and release on your master in order to get that punch both in the lows, mids, and the highs. All right. Pete Johns is here. Hey, Pete. Good to see you. Hope you're doing well, too. Daniel says, thank you so much for showing up. This was great. And then, so now I ask, are you going to release a book like the Mixing with 5 Plugins for the Mastering Your Mixes? At this point, I have no plans on doing that. I think this course is a lot better than if I were to try to explain this in a book, because being able to have you virtually sit down next to me and me showing you how these plugins work with audio examples of music from different genres. So I have an electronica track in there. I'm mixing a rock track, and then I have examples of sort of an indie rock, Brit rock track, and then a folk and a jazz tune. So there's plenty of material in there, and it's much easier for me to show you and give you results so that you can learn that process from me and use it on your own mixes to get great sounding records on your own. I think the course is a better option in general. And besides, I think it would be a pretty short book, honestly, because mastering is, although super important and all that, I don't have as much to say about mastering as I do about mixing. So that's why the course is such a better way to teach it. All right. Well, I think that's it for now. Do remember that Master Your Mixes closes tomorrow. So if you're interested in knowing more about mastering and how it can help you turn your already good mixes, but transform them into loud, punchy, and professional sounding records, that course is open until tomorrow night. So check that out at the link there. I'll put a link in the chat here for anybody who wants to know more about it, what you get, and all the details on the bonuses. I have 4 different bonuses there. There's another Q&A call for students. There's also I offer mix feedback for anybody that's working on a mix and wants to master it, so I can give them feedback on what's the best, what they can do to improve their mix so that it's the absolute best it can be before they start mastering it. And then there's some other bundle packages. So if you want to learn how to mix too, there's also a package for that. And then if you want to get my my full bundle that has the drum mix toolkit, which is the the drum mixing course, and the expert home vocals, which is the vocal production course. That's also available there. So go check that out if you are interested. Super awesome to see you guys in here. Enjoyed talking to you. I hope this was useful. If you have any questions or anything like that, I'll be sure to do another one of these lives sometime soon. But in the meantime, join Mastery Mixes before it closes tomorrow, and otherwise I'll see you around. Thanks for watching. Thanks for asking questions. Thanks for engaging with me. It's always a pleasure to have you here. It's always fun to actually know that I'm helping people directly in the moment. Like who was it? Yeah, like Sanel. So thank you so much for coming. I hope it was useful. And thanks for watching. And remember, use your ears. All right, see you guys later.